Today, we're stepping back in time to Imperial Russia, to a period of seismic change and ultimate tragedy. We're going to talk about Nicholas II, the last emperor of all Russia, a man who in many ways was a victim of his birthright, a pawn in a game of history that was far too grand and brutal for his gentle spirit. His story is a powerful reminder that even the most well-intentioned leaders can, through a combination of circumstance, personality, and sheer historical force, inadvertently steer their nations towards catastrophe. Nicholas's reign from 1894 to 1917 was a whirlwind of contradictions. It was an era of rapid industrialization, yes, but also of profound social unrest. It saw disastrous foreign wars that humiliated a proud nation, and ultimately, it culminated in a political collapse that would forever alter the course of Russian history. At the heart of it all was Nicholas himself, a man who believed with unwavering conviction that he was answerable only to God, a belief that made him stubbornly resist the rising tide of constitutional reform. This resistance, ironically, sealed his fate and the fate of his entire family. Let's begin at the very beginning, with his early life. Born Grand Duke Nicholas Alexandrovich on May 18, 1868, he was the eldest son of Tsarevich Alexander Alexandrovich, who would later become Tsar Alexander III, and Maria Feodorovna, a Danish princess. Imagine growing up in an environment overshadowed by a father like Alexander III. Alexander was a colossal figure, both physically massive and ideologically imposing. He was a staunch conservative, a ruler who governed with an iron fist, and his worldview was deeply shaped by a traumatic event: the assassination of his own father, Alexander II, by revolutionaries in 1881. This wasn't just a political event. It was a deeply personal trauma that forced the imperial family to retreat to the heavily guarded Gatchina Palace, creating a sheltered, almost suffocatingly controlled childhood for young Nicholas. His education was managed by Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the chief procurator of the Holy Synod. Now, Pobedonostsev was a brilliant man, but he was also a deeply reactionary scholar. He was the kind of mentor who didn't just teach facts, but instilled a rigid ideology. For Nicholas, this meant a lifelong conviction that autocracy was not just a form of government for Russia, but the only viable one. He was taught that democracy and constitutionalism are inherently corrupt, westernized imports, completely unsuitable for the Russian soul. And perhaps most importantly, he was taught that the Tsar was God's anointed vessel, chosen to protect the Orthodox faith and guide the nation. Despite a curriculum that was rich in history, languages, and military science, Nicholas in fact spoke flawless English, French, and German, a testament to his linguistic aptitude. His education critically lacked practical training in statecraft. His father, Alexander III, viewed him as a boy not yet ready for the harsh realities of power. He was often excluded from state councils and ministries, kept away from the levers of actual governance. So, while he possessed an innate, gentle courtesy and charm, Nicholas remained politically naive, intellectually ill-prepared for the immense responsibilities that awaited him. It's like training a brilliant musician, teaching them every note and technique, but never letting them conduct an orchestra. They might understand the theory, but they lack the practical experience to lead. Where Nicholas did find comfort, however, was in the structured, orderly world of the Russian military. He served in the prestigious Preobrazhensky Guards and the Hussar Regiment. He genuinely enjoyed the camaraderie, the parades, the simple discipline of barracks life. This was a world where orders were clear, roles were defined, and the complexities of human nature were distilled into rank and duty. It offered a stark contrast to the murky, treacherous waters of political leadership. In 1890, his father, hoping to broaden his horizons, sent Nicholas on an extensive grand tour of the East. This was a common practice for European royalty, a way to see the world and understand different cultures. Nicholas traveled through Egypt, India, Singapore, Siam, and Japan. But this grand tour took a dramatic and personal turn in April 1891 during a visit to Otsu, Japan. A fanatical Japanese policeman struck Nicholas on the head with a saber. He survived, but with a permanent scar, both physical and psychological. This incident, tragically, fueled a lifelong distrust of the Japanese nation, a distrust that would have devastating consequences later in his reign. Amidst all this, there was a profound personal story unfolding: his love for Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine. He met her in 1884, when he was 16 and she was 12, at the wedding of his uncle. It was, by all accounts, a deep and unwavering love that would endure until their very last moments. But as with all royal romances, it wasn't straightforward. Alexander III and Maria Feodorovna initially opposed the match. They had political ambitions for Nicholas, hoping he would marry a French princess to solidify Russia's alliance with France. Alex herself hesitated, distressed by the requirement that she renounce her Lutheran faith and convert to Russian Orthodoxy. But as Alexander III's health rapidly failed due to kidney disease in 1894, the dying Tsar relented. Alex traveled to Russia, accepted conversion, and took the name Alexandra Feodorovna. Then, on November 1, 1894, Alexander III died at the age of 49. And here we get a glimpse into the true nature of Nicholas. Overwhelmed and weeping, he confided to his cousin, "What is going to happen to me? To all of Russia, I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one." This wasn't false modesty. It was a genuine cry of despair from a man who knew, deep down, he wasn't cut out for the role. He was a loving son, a devoted husband-to-be, but not a natural-born autocrat. His marriage to Alexandra took place in a somber ceremony just weeks after his father's funeral. Their coronation followed in Moscow in May 1896. But even this moment of imperial grandeur was tragically marred. The celebrations were permanently stained by the Kodinka meadow disaster on May 30, 1896. Over 500,000 people gathered on a poorly managed public field to receive commemorative royal gifts. A rumor spread, a dangerous, baseless rumor, that there wasn't enough beer and pretzels for everyone. This sparked a massive stampede. Over 1,300 people were crushed or suffocated to death. Nicholas, deeply shocked by the news, wanted to cancel the remaining festivities and retreat to a monastery to pray. This was his natural, empathetic reaction. But his uncles, the Grand Dukes, urged him to attend a scheduled gala dinner hosted by the French ambassador, arguing that diplomatic ties had to be preserved. Nicholas reluctantly complied, and this decision, born out of a sense of duty, proved catastrophic for his public image. To the public, the young Tsar appeared callous, unfeeling, and indifferent to the suffering of his subjects. This event, so early in his reign, earned him the ominous moniker Nicholas the Bloody. It was a reputation he never truly shed, and it highlighted his fatal flaw: a disconnect between his personal empathy and the demands of imperial statesmanship. Now, let's look at his domestic policy, or rather his rigid autocracy. Nicholas began his reign by making it explicitly clear that he would tolerate no dilution of his absolute authority. When a delegation of local government representatives, known as Zemstvos, subtly petitioned for a constitutional voice in 1895, Nicholas famously dismissed their hopes as senseless dreams. This wasn't just a political statement. It was a declaration of his core belief, instilled by Pobedoncev, that his power was divine and untouchable. The burden of bureaucracy weighed heavily on Nicholas, and he contributed to it. He was a man of orderly habits, meticulous in his personal life, but he lacked the strategic vision required to run an empire spanning 1/6 of the globe. He insisted on working without a private secretary, personally reading and signing thousands of mundane administrative documents himself. This obsession with minutiae, this need to personally oversee every tiny detail, left him isolated from the grander systemic structural problems that were festering in his country. What were these problems? Well, for one, a rapidly expanding urban working class. These were people toiling under miserable factory conditions, living in squalor in the burgeoning industrial cities. Then there was the impoverished peasantry, the vast majority of Russia's population, desperate for land reform. They lived in traditional communes, often on land they didn't truly own, struggling to survive. And finally, there was a growing intellectual class, educated and aware of Western ideals, calling for basic civil liberties, for a voice, for a modern state. Nicholas, buried in paperwork, was effectively deaf to these cries. Despite this political stagnation, Russia did undergo massive industrial growth under Count Sergei Witte, a truly brilliant minister of finance. Witte was a visionary who stabilized the Russian ruble by adopting the gold standard, a crucial step for international trade and investment. He also secured massive foreign loans, primarily from France, to fund ambitious projects like the Trans-Siberian Railway. This rapid modernization created a booming industrial infrastructure, but it also had a dark side. It concentrated thousands of volatile, underpaid workers into crowded slums in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. These conditions, combined with a lack of political outlets, created a breeding ground for revolutionary ideology. Witte was building the future, but also, inadvertently, sowing the seeds of revolution. Moving to foreign affairs, Nicholas genuinely desired international peace. In 1899, he even initiated the Hague Peace Conference, which led to the creation of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, an early precursor to international justice. This shows a side of Nicholas that was genuinely progressive in some respects. Yet his foreign policy in Asia was reckless and expansionist. This was the era of imperial competition, and Russia, like other great powers, felt compelled to expand its influence. Driven by a desire for ice-free ports, a perennial Russian geopolitical ambition, and influenced by ambitious advisors, Nicholas approved Russian encroachment into Manchuria and Korea. Here his earlier trauma in Japan resurfaced. He consistently underestimated the military capability of Japan, privately referring to the Japanese people as monkeys and asserting that they would never dare to attack Russia. This racial prejudice and hubris were a dangerous combination. The inevitable clash came on February 8, 1904, when the Japanese Navy launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, sparking the Russo-Japanese War. This conflict was an unmitigated disaster for Russia, a humiliation on a scale almost unimaginable. The Russian army suffered devastating defeats at Liaoyang and Mukden. Port Arthur, a key naval base, surrendered after a brutal, prolonged siege. And, in May 1905, in one of the most decisive naval battles in history, the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed around the world for over 7 months to reach the Pacific, was completely annihilated by the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Tsushima. These crushing defeats shattered the myth of Russian military supremacy, a myth that had propped up the regime for centuries. It thoroughly humiliated the regime at home and abroad. Nicholas was forced to sign the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, brokered by American President Theodore Roosevelt, ceding territory and abandoning claims to Korea and southern Manchuria. The war was a wake-up call, but for Nicholas, it was a call he struggled to truly hear. The strain of the war brought domestic tensions to a boiling point. The domestic explosion began on Sunday, January 22, 1905, a day that would become known as Bloody Sunday. This event is a pivotal moment in Russian history, a rupture between the Tsar and his people. A charismatic Orthodox priest, Father Georgy Gapan, led a peaceful march of tens of thousands of workers, women, and children toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The marchers carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, intending to present a petition requesting higher wages, an 8-hour workday, and a constituent assembly. They genuinely believed their little father, the Tsar, would listen to their pleas. Nicholas, however, was not even present at the palace. He was at Tsarskoye Selo. Imperial guards and troops, panicked by the sheer size of the crowd, opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators. Hundreds were killed, and thousands were wounded. Bloody Sunday severed the traditional, mystical bond between the Russian peasantry and their little father. The illusion of a benevolent Tsar, a protector of his people, vanished in a hail of gunfire. It was a wound that would never heal. For the rest of 1905, Russia descended into near-total chaos. General strikes paralyzed the cities, peasant uprisings burned country estates, and mutinies broke out within the military, most notably on the battleship Potemkin, an event immortalized in film. Faced with the imminent collapse of his regime, Nicholas was forced to choose between establishing a military dictatorship and granting concessions. Count Witte again stepped forward, convincing the Tsar that only concessions could save the throne. On October 30th, 1905, Nicholas reluctantly issued the October Manifesto. This document, a monumental shift, guaranteed basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and conscience. Crucially, it promised the creation of a legislative assembly, the State Duma, and stated that no law could take effect without the Duma's explicit consent. For Nicholas, this was a profound betrayal of his coronation oath, a dilution of his God-given power. He wrote to his mother, "I feel as if I had committed a crime, so strange and terrible is this change." This sentiment perfectly encapsulates his internal conflict. He granted concessions out of necessity, but never truly believed in them. The promise of the October Manifesto, however, was quickly undermined. Just before the First Duma convened in 1906, Nicholas issued the Fundamental Laws. These laws essentially reasserted that the Tsar retained supreme autocratic power. He controlled foreign policy, commanded the military, and held an absolute veto over all legislation. It was a classic example of giving with one hand and taking back with the other. Nicholas despised the Duma, viewing it as an obstacle to his God-given rule. When the First and Second Dumas proved radically critical of the government, demanding sweeping land redistribution, a truly revolutionary change, Nicholas summarily dissolved them. He simply couldn't tolerate a body that challenged his authority. In 1907, his new prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, executed what amounted to a judicial coup. He illegally altered the electoral laws, drastically reducing the voting power of peasants and workers. This ensured that the Third Duma would be dominated by wealthy conservative landowners who were compliant with the crown. It was a shrewd, if undemocratic, move to create a more manageable legislature. Stolypin himself was a fascinating figure, a rare breed in late imperial Russia, a brilliant, ruthless statesman who understood that autocracy had to adapt to survive. He wasn't a democrat, but he recognized the need for fundamental change. He initiated a massive agrarian reform program designed to dismantle the traditional peasant communes. By allowing peasants to own individual private plots of land, Stolypin aimed to create a stable, loyal class of prosperous farmers, known as kulaks, who would have a stake in the system and thus reject revolutionary socialism. Simultaneously, Stolypin crushed political dissent with merciless efficiency. Special military courts executed thousands of suspected revolutionaries without formal trial. The gallows became grimly nicknamed Stolypin's neckties. This balance of reform and terror stabilized the country for a time. He was creating a new, more capitalist, more loyal peasantry while brutally suppressing any opposition. However, his aggressive policies alienated both the left-wing radicals, who saw him as a tyrant, and the ultra-conservative court factions, who resented his influence and his attempts to modernize Russia from within. In September 1911, Stolypin was shot and killed by a revolutionary who, in a twist of fate, was also an Okhrana, or secret police informant. His death removed the last truly capable minister Nicholas would ever employ, leaving a gaping void in the government. Away from the stress of statecraft, Nicholas found solace in his exceptionally close family life. Alexandra bore him 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and finally, in 1904, a male heir, Tsarevich Alexei. The birth of a son was a moment of immense joy and relief for the dynasty, ensuring the continuation of the Romanov line. But this joy was quickly shattered. Doctors discovered that Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a hereditary genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting. A minor bruise or fall could cause agonizing internal bleeding, threatening permanent crippling or even death. This was a closely guarded secret, a private tragedy that deeply affected the imperial couple. Desperate to protect her son, Empress Alexandra turned away from conventional medicine, which offered no treatment for hemophilia at the time. She sought spiritual healers, a common practice in an era where medical science was still limited. This desperation led her directly to Grigory Rasputin, a charismatic, unkempt peasant holy man, or starets, from Siberia. Rasputin possessed an undeniable ability to soothe the young Tsarevich during his bleeding crises. Historians speculate he might have used hypnosis, or simply a calming, reassuring presence that lowered the boy's blood pressure, which would help with clotting. Whatever the mechanism, to Alexandra, Rasputin was nothing short of a saint sent by God in answer to her prayers. He was the only one who could alleviate her son's suffering. Nicholas, while initially skeptical, came to accept Rasputin because he saw the peace the man brought to his distraught wife and fragile son. For him, Rasputin was a means to an end, the well-being of his family, especially Alexei. However, Rasputin's presence at court became a massive political liability. He indulged in notorious debauchery, heavy drinking, and sexual scandals in St. Petersburg, boasting openly of his influence over the imperial family. The public and the press, unaware of Alexei's secret illness, assumed that Rasputin was Alexandra's lover and the true power behind the throne. This deeply damaged the prestige of the Romanov dynasty, eroding public trust and fueling rumors of corruption and moral decay at the highest levels. It was a classic example of how a private tragedy, when mishandled in the public sphere, can become a political disaster. By 1914, Russia was recovering economically, thanks in part to Stolypin's reforms, but its geopolitical position remained fragile. Then, the spark that ignited the world arrived. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. Europe plummeted toward total war. Nicholas desperately sought to avoid a continental conflict. He engaged in a famous series of telegrams with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, known as the Willy-Nicky telegrams, urging moderation. This again shows his desire for peace. However, Russia viewed itself as the traditional protector of the Slavic peoples in the Balkans. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Nicholas faced intense pressure from his military staff, who argued that delaying mobilization would leave Russia defenseless against the Central Powers. On July 30, 1914, Nicholas signed the order for general mobilization. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia. The outbreak of World War I triggered a massive wave of national unity and anti-German sentiment. St. Petersburg, with its German-sounding name, was renamed Petrograd. Workers abandoned their strikes, and the Duma, despite its previous clashes with the Tsar, voted unanimously to fund the war effort. Nicholas stood on the balcony of the Winter Palace before thousands of kneeling subjects, experiencing a brief, deceptive resurgence of his popularity. For a moment, it seemed the nation had rallied around its Tsar. But this unity did not last long. The Russian army, though vast in numbers, suffered from incompetent leadership, abysmal logistics, and a severe shortage of weapons and ammunition. The disastrous defeats at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in late 1914 decimated the officer corps and cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties. It was a bloodbath, and the initial patriotic fervor quickly turned to despair and resentment. In August 1915, following a massive retreat from Poland and Galicia, Nicholas made what proved to be the ultimate mistake, a fateful decision that sealed his doom. He removed his cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, and took personal command of the Russian military. This move was catastrophic for two primary reasons. First, by identifying himself directly with the army, Nicholas took personal responsibility for every future military defeat in the eyes of his people. No longer could he blame his generals. Every casualty, every lost battle became his failure. He transformed himself from a distant, divinely appointed ruler into the direct leader of a failing war effort. Second, he left Petrograd to live at the military headquarters, known as Stavka, in Mogilev. This meant he effectively abandoned the civilian government to Empress Alexandra, and this, as we've discussed, was a recipe for disaster. With Nicholas away at the front, the Empress became the de facto ruler of Russia. Alexandra was deeply paranoid, suspicious of the Duma, and entirely under the influence of Rasputin. Together, they dismissed capable, loyal ministers and replaced them with incompetent sycophants who were favorable to Rasputin. This period of rapid political turnover became infamously known as ministerial leapfrog, as ministers were appointed and dismissed with bewildering speed, often at Rasputin's whim. Rumors grew wilder by the day, accusing the German-born empress of being a spy who was actively sabotaging the Russian war effort. These rumors, though baseless, gained traction in a society desperate for an explanation for Russia's military failures. In a desperate attempt to save the monarchy, a group of aristocrats, including Prince Felix Yusupov and the Tsar's cousin Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, assassinated Rasputin in December 1916. They believed removing him would remove the cancer at the heart of the court, but his death came too late. The rot within the imperial administration was already absolute. The public's trust was irrevocably broken. By the winter of 1916-1917, Russia was collapsing under the strain of total war. The railway network, already inefficient, failed completely, leaving major cities without regular food or fuel deliveries. Inflation skyrocketed, making what little was available unaffordable. The population of Petrograd was freezing and starving. The capital was a powder keg, ready to explode. The spark came on March 8, 1917, which was February 23 on the Julian calendar then used in Russia. International Women's Day demonstrations in Petrograd merged with bread riots and factory strikes. Tens of thousands of workers flooded the streets, chanting "bread" and "down with the autocracy." This wasn't just a political protest. It was a desperate cry for survival from a starving populace. Nicholas, still at Mogilev, received conflicting reports and, tragically, dismissed the crisis as a minor riot. He sent an order to the military commander of the Petrograd garrison: "I command you tomorrow to stop the disorders in the capital, which are unacceptable in this difficult time of war." He still believed his imperial will was enough to quell unrest. But the order backfired spectacularly. On March 11th, troops did fire on demonstrators, but the very next morning, the soldiers of the elite Volinsky regiment mutinied, refusing to shoot civilian crowds. Instead, they joined the protesters, arming them and helping them capture key government buildings. This was the moment of no return. The army, the ultimate guarantor of autocratic power, had deserted the Tsar. The imperial police forces dissolved, and the Duma, ignoring the Tsar's orders to suspend its sessions, instead formed a provisional committee to restore order. Concurrently, workers and soldiers established the Petrograd Soviet, creating a system of dual power, two competing authorities vying for control. The end of the line was in sight. Nicholas boarded the imperial train, intending to return to Tsarskoye Selo to be with his family. However, revolutionary railway workers diverted his train to Pskov, the headquarters of the Northern Front. There, isolated from his capital and surrounded by his generals, Nicholas faced the stark reality. His army chiefs, led by General Mikhail Alexeyev, informed him that the army could no longer support him. They argued that only his abdication could save Russia from a bloody civil war and allow the nation to continue fighting Germany. The generals, who had sworn allegiance to him, now told him his rule was over. On March 15, 1917, in a railway carriage at Pskov, Nicholas signed the instrument of abdication. Initially, he intended to abdicate in favor of his son Alexei, hoping to preserve the Romanov dynasty. But after his physician warned him that the boy, suffering from hemophilia, could not survive life in exile without his parents' constant care, Nicholas altered the document. He abdicated for both himself and his son, passing the crown to his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. The next day, Grand Duke Michael, prudently, refused the throne unless it was offered to him by an elected constituent assembly. He understood that the era of absolute monarchy was over. His refusal brought more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule to an abrupt, unceremonious end. In his diary that night, Nicholas wrote a line that summarized his profound sense of isolation and betrayal. "All around me is treason, cowardice, and deceit." A poignant, heartbreaking epitaph for a reign that ended not with a bang, but with a whimper in a railway car. Following his abdication, Nicholas returned to Tsarskoye Selo as a private citizen, reunited with his wife and children. The provisional government, led initially by Prince Georgy Lvov and later by Alexander Kerensky, placed the fallen imperial family under comfortable but secure house arrest at the Alexander Palace. Life at Tsarskoye Selo saw a surprising shift in Nicholas. Free from the crushing anxieties of state business, he adapted to his new life with a calm resignation that puzzled many observers. He spent his days chopping wood, gardening, walking in the palace grounds, and teaching history and geography to his children. He remained a deeply patriotic man, reading newspapers avidly and praying fervently for the success of the Russian army on the Eastern Front. It seems that without the burden of the crown, the gentle, family-oriented man he truly was could finally emerge. Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, hoped to arrange for the family to go into exile in Great Britain. This seemed like a natural choice, given the close familial ties between the Romanovs and the British royal family. However, King George V, Nicholas's first cousin and close friend, pressured the British government to withdraw their offer of asylum. The king feared that hosting the controversial deposed autocrat would spark a Republican backlash in Britain and threaten his own throne. It was a cold, pragmatic decision by one monarch to save his own crown at the expense of his cousin's safety. As the political climate in Petrograd turned increasingly violent and radical, Kerensky decided to move the Romanovs out of harm's way. In August 1917, the family was quietly evacuated to Tobolsk in western Siberia. They lived in the former governor's mansion under relatively lenient supervision, continuing their quiet routine of study, prayer, and outdoor exercise through the harsh Siberian winter. For a brief period, they found a semblance of peace. But the situation changed completely in November 1917, when Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party overthrew the provisional government in the October Revolution. The lenient treatment ended immediately. The Bolsheviks, driven by a fierce anti-monarchist ideology, slashed the family's rations, restricted their walks, and replaced their polite guards with hostile, ideologically driven Red Guards. The atmosphere became one of oppressive hostility. In April 1918, as anti-Bolshevik counter-revolutionary forces, known as the White Army, began organizing throughout Russia, Moscow ordered the family moved closer to the revolutionary heartland. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their daughter Maria were moved first, followed later by the other children, to the industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. In Yekaterinburg, the family was confined inside the heavily fortified mansion of a local merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. The Bolsheviks grimly designated the building the House of Special Purpose. It was a chilling name for their final prison. A brutal confinement awaited them. The windows of the Ipatiev house were painted white to prevent the family from looking out or being seen from the street. A high wooden palisade was constructed around the perimeter, further isolating them. The family was subjected to constant surveillance, crude insults, and aggressive searches by their guards. It was psychological torment designed to break their spirit. Despite this, Nicholas maintained his stoicism, drawing strength from his deep religious faith. He and his family regularly held private prayer services, preparing themselves mentally for an uncertain, increasingly dangerous future. They found solace in their faith and in each other, By July 1918, the Russian Civil War was raging across Siberia. The Czech Legion, allied with the anti-Bolshevik White Army, was advancing rapidly on Yekaterinburg, threatening to capture the city and liberate the former Tsar. The Bolshevik leadership in Moscow, with the approval of Vladimir Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov, made a cold, calculated decision. Unwilling to let Nicholas become a powerful rallying symbol for the counter-revolutionaries, they sent a secret execution order to the local authorities. The night of July 16-17, 1918, became one of the darkest chapters in Russian history. Yakov Yurovsky, the newly appointed commandant of the Ipatiev house and head of the local Cheka, or secret police, was tasked with organizing the executions. Shortly after midnight, on July 17, Yurovsky woke the imperial family's physician, Dr. Eugene Bodkin. He told him that the city was in danger and that the family must be moved to the basement for their own safety. It was a cruel deception. Nicholas, carrying his frail son Alexei, led his family down into a small semi-basement room. Along with Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were 4 loyal retainers who had chosen to stay with them into exile. Dr. Eugene Bodkin, Anna Demidova, Alexandra's maid, Alexei Trupp, footman, and Ivan Karatanov, cook. They were a small, devoted group, bound by loyalty to the very end. 3 chairs were brought into the bare room. Alexandra sat in one, and Nicholas sat in another, supporting Alexei on his lap. The 4 daughters stood behind their parents. A few moments later, Yurovsky entered the room with a firing squad of secret police officers. He stepped forward and read a brief statement aloud. Nicholas Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas, stunned, turned to face his family, then turned back to Yurovsky, asking, "What? What?" Yurovsky quickly repeated the statement and raised his pistol, firing directly into the former Tsar's chest. Nicholas died instantly. The room erupted into an undisciplined, chaotic frenzy of gunfire and smoke. Alexandra and Dr. Botkin were shot next. The execution took far longer than planned, because, in a truly remarkable and tragic detail, the Grand Duchesses had sewn diamonds, pearls, and precious amulets into the linings of their corsets. These acted as makeshift armor, deflecting the initial bullets. The executioners were forced to finish the executions using bayonets and close-range headshots. Within 20 minutes, all 11 people in the room were dead. It was a brutal, horrific end to an imperial line. The aftermath was equally gruesome. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven into the Koptyaki forest outside Yekaterinburg. To prevent the remains from ever being recovered by monarchists and treated as holy relics, Yurovsky's men stripped the corpses, mutilated their faces with acid, burned the remains over open bonfires, and threw them down an abandoned mineshaft. Still dissatisfied, Yurovsky dug up the remains the next day and reburied them in a shallow, muddy trench beneath log sleepers in a nearby cart track known as Pig's Meadow. The secrecy and brutality of the disposal speak volumes about the Bolsheviks' fear of the Romanovs becoming symbols of counter-revolution. For decades, the Soviet government refused to acknowledge the full extent of the crime, initially claiming that only Nicholas had been executed and that his family had been moved to a safe location. By the mid-1920s, they admitted the entire family was dead, but kept the location of the bodies a state secret, fueling endless rumors and legends. The truth, however, eventually came out. In 1979, amateur Russian investigators Alexander Avdonin and Gely Ryabov located the mass grave in Pig's Meadow, but they kept their discovery secret until the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the grave was officially excavated. DNA testing, which included genetic samples from Britain's Prince Philip, confirmed the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. The remains of Alexei and 1 daughter, either Maria or Anastasia, were missing from the main grave, fueling decades of rumors that some of the children had escaped. However, in 2007, a second, smaller burial site was discovered nearby, containing the missing remains of Alexei and his sister, finally, completely debunking the survival myths. The entire family had indeed perished that night. On July 17, 1998, exactly 80 years after their murder, Nicholas II and his family were interred with full state honors in the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, joining the tombs of their Romanov ancestors. It was a moment of national reckoning and closure for many. In August 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church officially canonized Nicholas II, his wife, and their children as passion bearers, saints who faced their deaths with Christ-like humility and resignation. It was a recognition not of their political leadership, but of their personal suffering and faith. So what is the legacy of Nicholas II? He was, without a doubt, a man of deep personal piety, an affectionate husband, and a loving father. These were his strengths, the qualities that made him human and relatable in his personal life. Yet, as a ruler, his tragic inability to comprehend the socio-political realities of his empire cost him his throne, his life, and his family. He was a man out of time, clinging to an archaic vision of autocracy in an era demanding modernization and reform. His story is a poignant reminder that good intentions and personal virtue are not enough to govern a vast, complex nation in the throes of revolutionary change. His reign ended more than 3 centuries of Imperial Romanov history and opened a dark, bloody chapter in modern Russian history, the echoes of which still resonate today. The story of Nicholas II isn't just about a monarch's fall. It's a profound lesson in leadership, the perils of isolation, and the unstoppable force of historical change. It shows us how deeply personal beliefs can clash with national realities, and how a leader's character, for better or worse, can shape the destiny of millions. He was a Tsar who never wanted to be one, and in that reluctance, perhaps, lay the seeds of his and his empire's destruction. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the life and reign of Nicholas II. I hope you've gained a richer understanding of this complex and tragic figure, and the tumultuous era he lived through. Join us next time on Echoes of History as we uncover another captivating story from the past.